buenos días, tengan todas y todos ustedes.
Good morning
Buenas
to each and
tardes,
every one of you.
buenas
Good
noches en
evening,
algunas
good
partes
afternoon,
del
good
mundo.
night in some
Hoy
parts
damos
of the
inicio
world.
al
Today
tercer
we're going
día
to
de
start with our
trabajos de la
third
cumbre de la
day of
democracia
session
electoral.
from the Global Summit on Electoral Democracy. And today we're going to talk about expectations at a short and long term, what to do for democracy. In this regard, I would like to ask to carry out the opening of this session to Corinne Momalbanian, Executive Director from the Kofi Annan Foundation. Dr. Momalbanian, I give you the floor. Muchísimas gracias, Manuel.
A todos. My role is to welcome you this morning and to sort of start the conversation. So welcome to those of you who are in Mexico in person and those joining online for this third and final day of this global forum of the Summit for Democracy. So first of all, though, before we launch into the discussion, I really want to thank the Instituto Nacional Electoral for bringing us all together and congratulate INE colleagues on successfully organizing not only this summit, but the series of regional meetings that have preceded it over the past year. It was really a very ambitious effort and you've succeeded, so congratulations. As I noted when the whole process was launched a few months ago, I think there's general consensus that democracy is in retreat all over the world and has been so globally since probably about 2006. According to the latest democracy report, which is issued annually by the VDEM Institute of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, one of our partners, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2021 was down to 1989 levels. So I'd like you to pause a moment to reflect about the fact that we're back 30 years, that we have gone back where we were 30 years ago. 70% of the world population now lives under autocratic rule. Even in democracies, and we know it, and there's been some discussion of that over the past few days, even in democracies, challenges are increasing. Challenges to established institutions are increasing. Traditional political institutions are perceived by many as lacking inclusivity and are as being unable to respond to the needs of all citizens. Young people in particular continue to be disenfranchised and disillusioned by democracy. They constitute, the young people under 30 years of age comprise more than 50% of the global population, and they are still very rarely included in democratic processes and high-level decision-making, which is leading to diminishing levels of confidence in democracy and electoral processes in general among young people. The other challenge, and there's been a lot of discussion of that as well, is that digital technologies are having a detrimental impact on social cohesion and on democracy and electoral processes in particular. Under the leadership of INE, these and many other issues have been discussed in detail at the various regional forums held as part of the summit this year. And I understand, I was unfortunately not in Mexico, but I understand that the past 2 days you've had very rich conversations and you've been able to review the outcomes and findings of the regional forums and to further discuss key themes such as reinvigorating democracy in the post-pandemic age. Today, all of us will consider the state of democracy in Africa with introductory remarks by my colleague Arnaud Akogenu, who has had a very distinguished career in the United Nations in peacekeeping and humanitarian agencies at very senior level, and he will brief us on the state of democracy in West Africa. You will review the short and medium-term future of democracy, as Manuel has noted. and the role of electoral management bodies and political parties in delivering elections with integrity, which remained the founding block of democracy. If I can make maybe one observation before I leave you to these important deliberations, there's one aspect which is common to all the themes that have been discussed and will be discussed today, and that is that I have already mentioned, and that is young people. Africa, we'll discuss Africa today, is the youngest continent. The average age is 19.7 years. But in Africa, as elsewhere, as I mentioned, young people are disillusioned with democracy. They're also disenfranchised. They have no access to the levels of power. They do not see democracy as capable of delivering on their hopes and aspirations, nor of giving them a real say in society. And data on youth involvement in parliaments, for instance, is telling us that democratic institutions' commitment to engage meaningfully with young people is not there yet. We are, or as I mentioned, young people under the age of 30 constitute 50% of the world's population, but only 2.2% of the world's parliamentarians. Those are the figures issued by the Interparliamentary Union. So only 2.2% of parliamentarians. So it's very difficult to talk about representative democracy in this context. The short and medium-term future of democracy will depend, which we'll discuss today, will depend on us reversing this trend and including the current generation. They're not even the future generations, they are the current generations. We must find ways to re-engage young people and give them a real voice in decision-making. One way would be to lower the age of eligibility to run for office. If you are old enough to run to vote, you should be old enough to run for elections. And governments and parliaments can also use, and electoral management bodies can also use digital platforms to engage in true dialogues with young people who are comfortable and familiar with these tools. And the focus of youth engagement should be on causes. We know that young people are not process-driven, they're cause-driven. So this would be a much more effective way of engaging young people. Political parties and, as I said, electoral management bodies can also play key roles in reaching out and engaging young people, putting them up for office, ensuring they know how to vote, ensuring that they're registered, and educating them in general on democratic processes. So this is something that I really think is very important that the Kofi Annan Foundation is working on. And I think these are, and a number of our other partners in this summit, I know, are also very actively engaged on. So I just want to say at the end of my brief remarks that not all is doom and gloom. Day after day, we see positive practices of democracy in countries around the world. And surveys show that the aspirations of people to democracy remain undiminished. So the principle of democracy endures, even when the practice has suffered over the past 2 decades, but there are still good practices. And our role is also to highlight them and share them and disseminate them. So I hope that the summit will yield practical recommendations on how to address the many challenges of democracy today. And I want to thank again, really, Ine, for bringing us all together for this very important conversation. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Karin Mamal-Banyan, in this third session that we're carrying out in this summit that has a global integrated view, different problems that we face as electoral democracy. First day, we talk about principles and values of democracy. The second day about procedures and the electoral member bodies, and today expectations at a short and long term of our democracy. And first day we were concentrated in a message from the General Secretariat from the United Nations, and second day of the European Union talk. And today, as you mentioned, in regard to Africa, now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Arno Kedun, who is from the Kofi Annan Foundation. I give him the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And allow me, for sake of consistencies, I will avoid to move into face-to-face process. Allow me to remain throughout my 5 to 7 minutes on only what I call oral presentation, not virtual one, face-to-face one. Thank you very much. I would like to add my words to the compliment made by the executive director for Kofi Annan Foundation, and to let you know that I will go through four steps in my presentation. The first one will be to make a reference to a recent colloquium which took place in Dakar, and then which was more related to West Africa, and to zoom it a bit at the level of the African continent, and to share what came out from that particular meeting with you, and to see to what extent we can end up with some general points or general ways forward in terms of the future of the democracy in Africa. The colloquium in Dakar was convened by the UNOAS. UNOAS is the UN regional body based in Dakar, and the Kofi Annan Foundation, National Democratic Institute, and Open Society joined their effort to support that initiative. And we focus more on the situation at the level of the West Africa. But before going to that, all the participants were more, many experts, many practitioners, civil society representative, and so on and so forth. We went through the continent status, the continental status of democracy. And we were all, I would say, very, very preoccupied by the fact that the state of democracy in Africa is not as well as one can think or perceive it. And on top of that, that vary from one region to another. While there could be some satisfaction from what is going on in southern part of the continent, the east and the west remain worrying through a worrying situation, and a lot of concern in relation to the Horn of Africa, Central of Africa, and the northern part of the continent, but also the western part of the continent. Despite the fact that there have been a range of regional, first continental and regional conventions dealing with governance, dealing with human rights, and dealing with democracy issue, to name some. Already in 1961, there is the Lagos Charter, followed by OAU chapter in 1981, and then we moved to AU as such in 2002, ending with a very, very good and further very well elaborated document we call the Charter, and that came on 2007. And that document had been ratified 5 years later by a range of countries, as we speak now, and there I'm quoting the statistic of July 2022, 36 out of 54, 55 countries ratified that document. But despite this adoption of continental, regional convention on democracy, governance, more and more countries, but in particular statements, are trying to confiscate the power and not to get implemented all those substantive elements which could have brought some difference in the living condition of so many people. My reference remain in terms of the issue of concern to all of us, remain this 2007 charter, where three points need to be highlighted. The first one was to protect or to promote and protect the human and the people's rights. And the second one is to make sure that that protection or that establishment of rule is done through a democratic culture. And the second key point was to consolidate any institution which might come out from that process. And the last one was related to the promotion of governance and the rule of law. Let me bring you back to this colloquium, the recent colloquium, which was, from my point of view, a successful one, even if it was regional aspect of the problem we are talking about. One need to highlight the fact that we came to the conclusion through our observation that there were progress, but the progress made in 19 did not really bring more fruit on the table, in particular during the last part of this, the 2 decades we went through. And there are more and more now puches and pronunciamiento over the last 20 years. And throughout, in particular, West Africa, and to some extent, central parts of the continent. The bottom line of all these processes is that there are more non-democratic countries than democratic countries in Africa. And during our exchange and discussion in Dakar, we focused on 4 areas. The first one was related to political parties, the quality of the elections. We brought on the table for discussion what we call ECOWAS, which is the regional West African body, what they call additional protocol related to the constitution. And the last point we went through in terms of observation, conclusion, and recommendation was the security and its impact on the governance of that region. And there are 2 points which we did not really manage to bring on the table in terms of discussion and way forward. The first one was the question of the state in Africa. That remained very, very important. And the second one is the troubled perception of the democracy in the continent. Those 2 points need to be linked, and we need to speak about institution in the way people could live together under institution which they all recognize and accepted with what I will call a specific caveat. Pay more and more attention to the history and to the culture of region, of countries, and of the country on the continent. In terms of short-term, mid-term, long-term, the key point, I will conclude on those points, the key point is that the political will, and along with this political will, the establishment and the acceptance of institutions, the acceptance of the particularity of the situation, and to some extent, the background of the people who are called to live together. My key point here is that there are some elements missing. The first element remains inclusivity. The second one is the transparency. And the third one is the fair. All those elements could be put together and work out to a proper rule of law accepted by everyone and implemented in a very just, fair, and honest way. My last point, talking about Africa in terms of democracy, in terms of election and so on, is the civic education, which is really needed. The civic education, not only at the level of the entire continent, but at the level of specific countries, and at the end, at the level of the region. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias al señor Acodianu.
Thank you very much, Akot main counselor of the Kofi Annan Foundation in Africa. Thank you very much for sharing with us this vision, this global vision of these topics regarding electoral democracy. I would like to communicate you, to notify you that Mr. Jacques Attali is indisposed with some health issues, as we were informed this morning. We wish him the best. We have now Mr. Michael Frendo, Vice President of the Venice Commission, to use this time during our summit on electoral democracy to address our audience. We invited Dr. Jacqueline Pechard, professor and researcher of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, with a lot of experience in electoral matters, to moderate this session. Dr. Pechard? Thank you very much, Manuel, for your presentation. We are really sorry that Professor Attali cannot be here today, but we want to thank Michael Frendo, Vice President of the Venice Commission, to come and address the audience. A lot has been said in regional forums, and in this summit, that democracies today are under threat given high levels of poverty, inequality, the ever more visible issues of corruption, impunity, and some other worldwide issues that are no longer a risk but a certainty, like the environmental crisis, food catastrophe, the lack of strategic raw material, and the threat of a new pandemic. Therefore, the question is, will we be able to get together and find shared solutions? What are our expectations in the short and medium term? How can we make use of forums such as this one to think about new alternatives so that we can reconfigure our democracies? We cannot go back to the pre-pandemic democracy, to our pre-pandemic conceptions. We have to reconfigure democracies in the 21st century. Michael Frendo, Vice President of the Venice Commission, former President of the Malta Parliament, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Malta, representative between 1987 to 2013, telecommunications, transportation, and technology minister, radio, broadcast, culture, youth, sports minister. He's a member of the European Convention on the Future of Europe and signatory of the 2007 Lisbon Treaty. He's a member of the College of Lawyers of Malta, and he teaches at the university. He coordinates the course of law regarding betting houses and casinos. He has a PhD in law from the Malta University, and he received also a postgraduate degree from Exeter University University in the United Kingdom. He has published numerous articles and books, and we are really thankful with Dr. Frendo for joining us today. Thank
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that Jakat Ali couldn't make it. I have been reading not only his books, but also listening to his lectures, and he is, as I said earlier, an excellent presenter. I have prepared my remarks initially because I was going to be part of the closing part of the conference, but I will adjust them also to address some of the points which have been raised now. Let me start from the fundamentals. Let me start from the fact that this World Summit for Electoral Democracy comes at a time when we really see an increase in autocracies, and we just had a reference from Corinne Mamal-Vanyan to the fact that 70% of the population of the world are actually under autocratic rule. But we don't only see an increase in autocracies, we also see an increase in the exaltation of autocracies. So we are seeing that autocracies are increasing, but also that there is a propaganda in favor of autocracies as being more effective. We have strongman cultures where functioning, healthy liberal democracies are sometimes, through these tactics, transformed into ill democracies or impaired or flawed democracies. And where you have populism, which flies in the face of and defies the principles of the rule of law and constitutional constraints. And we are seeing that these problems are not only in new democracies, we are seeing them also in mature democracies. We have seen the realities where from separation of powers, where instead of having rule by Congress and the executive, you end up having rule governance by Twitter. We have seen these realities, and because we've seen these realities happening more and more in our time, this summit is really timely because it has become ever more important for those who retain the faith in electoral democracies, in representative government, to get together and to assert not only the right of the people to choose their own government in free and fair elections, this is a basic right, but also the benefits of individual freedom, respect for human rights, the rule of law, and perhaps very importantly, the exercise of power within democratic constitutional constraints. In fact, to equate democracy, as very often is happening today, simply with the right of the majority to govern as the sole will of the representatives, is really to negate democracy. Professor Larry Diamond, in his intervention on the first day of the summit, rightly said, we must lower the political temperature in the political discourse in democracy. Indeed, the strength of a democracy can only be measured by the level of that temperature. And what is happening here? We have also to raise that temperature, a culture of vilification and vituperative exchanges, very often on the social media. So the importance of the social media in relation to the temperature of politics, to the temperature of democracies, I think cannot be underestimated. And in this context, there is another issue which we need, in my opinion, to take very seriously and to make sure that our laws and our constitutional frameworks address this problem, is that we must decisively walk away from the model of a situation where who wins the elections wins everything. The winner takes all model must be something we should shy away from as much as we can. We must hone our constitutional order in order that the winner takes all cannot prevail as a concept in a system which remains importantly a system of checks and balances, but not only between the institutions, between the major institutions, normally the government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature and the parliament. Not only among the three institutions of the state power, but also within the institutions themselves. When we talk about representative government, when we're talking about cabinet government, for example, in a prime ministerial context, we should be looking on how also that joint cabinet power is exercised, rather than have what is sometimes referred to, at least by some writers. I remember one reference in Ivor Jennings' cabinet government referring to the British model. He called the prime minister an elected monarch. We have to look at the checks and balances within institutions themselves, not just checks and balances between the various institutions of the state. The Council of Europe, European Commission for Democracy Through Law, better known as the Venice Commission, in which I currently have the honor to serve as one of the elected vice presidents, is dedicated inter alia to just do this, to strengthen constitutional systems, to reflect on the highest European standards of democratic practice, and to disseminate that practice among as many countries as possible, not only within the European context, but beyond that. To promote the rule of law and democracy, and to advise, and this is of course at the core of what the Venice Commission does, to advise on constitutional, legislative, and administrative principles that serve the efficiency of democratic institutions and their strengthening. And this is practical work which the Venice Commission carries out in relation to practical and real situations in countries, whether they are its member states or whether it is at the request of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This is practical work where the opinion of the Venice Commission is put across to the country so that the country can see whether it wants to reach the higher standards of European experience in this regard. So it is in a way a guiding light where the Commission is dedicated to assisting in the formulation of legal norms that create the right framework for a healthy democracy to the benefit of all the citizens of the land. Of course, at the heart of democracy, we have electoral democracy. We have as the pediment, the base, the fundamental element, the fact that there are free and fair elections. And in this regard, I have to bring to attention that in 2002, of course, the Venice Commission adopted its code of good practice in electoral matters. Again, a practical contribution to assist, particularly electoral management bodies, but not only them, also the media, also those who scrutinize how elections are carried out, to assist in indicating what are the levels, the standards which should be followed in regards to electoral matters. And this code today has been established as a model. And indeed, it has been espoused not only by many electoral management bodies around the world, but sometimes even by regional organizations of management bodies around the world. For example, the Organization of Arab Electoral Management Bodies has also adopted this as its official code of good practice for its members. After all, no good can flow from elections that are not free and fair. That's where we start from. In accordance with the universally accepted principles of universal, free, equal, and secret suffrage that is exercised within a framework of respect for fundamental rights, a stable and fair electoral law, laws which don't change on the eve of an election. This is an extremely important principle, and strong procedural safeguards to ensure the implementation of those stated principles. This is indeed a measuring stick and a guide for democratic electoral practice. And it is a service, one of the services which the Venice Commission has given to our democratic community. However, of course, as has been said in this summit, as has been said also by others, a democratic way of life is not defined just by a moment or moments in time. An election to choose one's parliament and government is a moment in time, but it is also defined as a democratic way of government, and very importantly, by what happens between elections. Pluralism, freedom of speech and association, respect for the rule of law remain, among other fundamentals, essential building blocks for democracy. And in today's populist cultural context, I would add also another fundamental, and that would be the non-abuse of referenda as a justification to bypass constitutional frameworks. Again, we have seen also examples of this, where in order to create a new constitutional order, you depart from the existing one simply by putting a new constitutional order to a referendum, but not taking into account the methods of change of a constitution which are inbuilt into the constitution itself. Again, a result very often of a populist approach to power. In other words, winner takes all, and power justifies also bypassing legal constraints. As social and economic and political contexts change and develop, so must democracies. Democracies need to retain dynamism to address new challenges and remain able to improve people's lives. We have been told about the issue that young people feel dissociated from the political process. This can happen both in autocracies, and it is more likely to happen in autocracies where people lose hope of being able to influence decision-making in the country. But it can also happen in democracies if they feel that they cannot reach into the decision-making process of the country, and there's a disconnect between the parliamentary representatives and the institutions and the young people themselves. And this is an issue which must be taken very seriously, because this is where disillusionment with democracy and where the slide back from democracy starts. So it is important for us to continue to show that democracies actually are improving people's lives, that they are, and this is an essential part of what democracies are like. And I think it is also showing us that when you speak about electoral liberal democracy, representative democracy, this is always work in progress. We have to stop taking anything for granted. I think we have seen over the last decade or so that whatever was taken for granted very often has gone away, as no longer a possibility to have around. And therefore, we must continue to show the value of what we do to have a democratic way of life. And that starts with the young, that starts in the schools, that starts in education, that starts in formation at all levels of education, including the tertiary level of education. I believe that what this summit is doing is extremely important, because it has given us a moment of reflection. It has given us a moment of collecting thoughts, of sharing experiences, to further a system of government that, however imperfect, remains the best for what we think is the best for the happiness of the human race. We know, all of us, the words of Winston Churchill, that of course are words we speak about the imperfection of democracy, but then that this imperfection of democracy still makes it better from, and I quote, all the others that have been tried. On behalf of the Venice Commission, I truly congratulate INE for organizing this World Summit for Electoral Democracy and for bringing all these thoughts for us to share. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor Frente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frendo. And that's right. When we see that 70% of population is living in autocracy, and that according to surveys, and surveys and consultations on how much democracy is appreciated, we have seen a decrease, a drop in citizens' trust in democracy. And that is something that we have to face. As you say, this has a lot to do with the media and the relation between media and power going through a period of no collaboration between the media and the government. Media, from their social function of criticism of the government, seem not to have a clear answer from the government regarding the role media plays. You mentioned the need, that there is a need to change the idea that after elections, the winner takes all and will keep it all until the next elections. And therefore, the checks and balances systems must be introduced within the institutions and not just when it comes among institutions like the executive and the legislative or different groups of power. And this idea that the winner should not take it all should not happen, as it said, that happens with populist governments who have made the idea of a referendum as something sacred, like a direct democracy, like something that can face and address all the threats to our democracy. Because direct democracy has to be the exception, just a complement. And we should be
defenderla porque está asediada por poderes surgidos de los propios procesos democráticos. Y dicha defensa debe de hacerse mediante mecanismos democráticos para que los problemas estructurales se resuelvan dentro de los límites de nuestras constituciones republicanas. Entonces, lo que tenemos que hacer es pensar que la democracia no solamente está asediada por quienes están en la cúpula del poder, sino que también hay un número reducido de quienes tienen el valor de defender sus valores y principios. El rescate de nuestra democracia no solamente depende de quienes gobiernan, aunque tienen la primerísima responsabilidad, sino que los ciudadanos, que somos los más perjudicados por su deterioro, somos
damaged by democracy deterioration, must also stand up and defend democracy. Like you said, democracies don't improve overnight. It is a process, a constant process, and the best way of facing this huge challenge to prevent the erosion of democracy, to prevent losing the trust from citizens, it is necessary to look not just at the democracy within each country, but also look around at the worldwide perspective and have international collaboration, everyone working together to face the threats of democracy, which is still the best and fairest way of governing countries. Thank you very much.
So after listening to Mr. Frendo and Mrs. Bechard, this first keynote is concluded. We have a 3 minutes break. So we have our next panel in regard to EMBs. Thank you very much.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
Porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia. Pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos, logramos que todas las voces cuenten. Unidas y unidos vivimos en una democracia sin muros que nos dividan. Unidas.
Luchamos por nuestros derechos.
Y unidos hemos conseguido tener elecciones libres y auténticas. Por eso inspiramos al mundo para proteger la democracia, los derechos y nuestras libertades, porque ese es el camino de la paz. México es sede de la Cumbre Global de la Democracia Electoral, porque en el mundo y en México, nuestro INE nos une.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches en algunas partes del mundo donde nos están escuchando y siguiendo este tercer día de la cumbre de la
Third session of the Summit on Electoral Democracy. Today is our last session, the last day of sessions where we're going to be talking about short and long-term electoral bodies, what we're going to do, and we're going to talk about electoral democracy perspective, EMBs responsible of elections and political parties. First, so our moderator is electoral counselor Martin Faz, who I would like to give the floor to him. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you in this global summit, and mainly in regard to electoral democracy perspective, EMB is responsible of elections and the political parties, something that's really necessary in any democratic process. And political parties, as we know, they get organized to compete in the electoral process. Theoretically talking, I have to say that one of the main objectives is really not to carry out the elections process, because in most democracies it's different. There's a difference between the political parties that contend and the MPs. And we depart from the premise of not having a conflict of interest between the political parties and the regulators, the MBs. And I have to say that that doesn't mean, of course, that there must be a barrier of exclusion between political parties and the MBs of the electoral process. Transparency, trust, and efficiency, therefore legitimacy and adequate behavior during elections, we can reach them when political parties are present in all the stages of given process than when elections are left in the hands of the electoral member bodies with no contact or communication with political parties. And the political parties, I have to say, they have to know all issues about processes that could affect them directly or indirectly, and they must participate in the process of some of the decisions. And there are various mechanisms for the participation and inclusion of political party representatives or candidates, and the MBs accountable of the electoral management, either by participating in the review of the electoral laws and including political parties as member of the electoral college, number 9 and minor, as observants that do not vote. They observe the MB's process as those that monitor the electoral processes on key positions, like, for example, the registry, the balloting, the counting of votes, and the consultative committee's creation, integrated by all political parties and candidates to suggest actions in regard to how elections are carried out. Many mechanisms that each electoral model must define. In this panel, our speakers are going to talk to us about some of the challenges and perspectives of this necessary relationship between political parties and the EMBs. And first, we're going to listen to Salvador Romero, and then we're going to hear Ann Pence, and at the end, Monica Chacon, and you already have his curriculum vitae, so I will not mention them because of time issues. You know, they're experts on the topic. So I give the floor for 7 minutes to Mr. Salvador Romero. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm going to try to reflect about the electoral and democracy perspectives in the next years. What could be the probabilities of the MBs, what they could be facing in the electoral processes in the next 10 or 15 years. I'm going to try to do so, talking about 7 possible issues. First, we're going to have most probably, and we're going to have elections that are going to be technically quite solid from the technical point of view during its whole process of preparation, because there's a huge logistic and administrative experience accrued in the region and how we face the pandemic situation. We know that we have the capacity to face these technical challenges. And that's the first evolution. The second one, most probably we're going to have elections that are going to be including a greater number, let's say, of technological ingredients, biometric data, and also we're going to see the extension of electronic vote and inclusively tests of voting through internet. Some countries are carrying them out, and maybe we're going to have more essays. So electoral processes with new technological ingredients. Third component, elections that are going to have a greater component of equity in regard to its representation. I mean, with an impact on people's diversity that are candidates and people that are elected. And we're going to have, without doubt, greater presence of women in the different decision-making processes, with a strong trend from Latin America. Greater presence on given spaces of main decision-making processes of indigenous people and also Afro-descendant people. And without doubt, it's going to be a moment of analysis, reflection, debate, polemic, controversial discussions in regard to gender quotas and for other groups. And this is going to be one of the main debates in the Latin American democracies and elections carried out on the region. Fourth evolution, we're going to have shared elections. What do I mean? They're going to be weaker, disarticulated, with a lesser amount of militants, but as a paradox subjected to demands, stronger demands as from the legislation. And given elections are going to be developed with parties, political parties that are going to be disordered, disorganized, and decomposed. This is one of the main challenges that we're going to have to face during our EMB's activities. And the fifth point, we're going to have elections that are going to be carried out under a political crisis. What do I mean? Elections that most probably are going to be very tense, with mistrust to institutions, actors, procedures, democratic and electoral procedures. And we're also going to have ungiven difficult and complicated processes, a feedback between polarization and fake news that are going to feed each other. And in that pathway, difficult one, the electoral member bodies are going to face these stronger challenges. The fifth issue is that in some sites, not in all, in some of them, unfortunately, more numerous ones, the electoral processes and DMVs, they're gonna have to face more harassment, and they could be subjected by some governments. And this is a consequence of a given general context of stagnation and of backsliding. And this is going to lead us to impact our electoral processes. And this leads us that in some Latin American sites, we're going to have elections with less democratic attributes. And when I think about them, I'm thinking about elections with less competitiveness, more pluralism, less opportunities of having a good, independent, and impartial electoral observance at a domestic or international level. And in some Latin American countries, what is going to disappear is the horizon of having alternates. And locally, specifically, most probably, we're going to have electoral processes that are going to be more violent due to the presence of organized crime. Therefore, and with this, I would like to conclude my remarks. What can we do before these seven possible situations, some positive and others not so good? First, we need to pay attention to democratic attributes during elections. We have left them at one side. We take them for granted. We took them for granted, and we just saw the technical aspects in regard to what technically is working or not, and if they're responding technically adequately or not. That's quite important. But we have to go back and see if elections have the democratic attributes as a foundation, and that we shall not be leaving them at one side. and all the alerts must be on in regard to any electoral deterioration, lack of competitiveness against these democratic attributes, because the backsliding of democracy is not produced by an abrupt event that occurs one day, but they're produced because there's a progressive backsliding. And one of these backsliding occurs precisely in this backlash in regard to the democratic quality of the electoral processes. And we must be extremely alert to be able to check them. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Romero. And now, Dr. Ann Pence, who is with us remotely, I give her the floor.
Thank you so much, and thanks to INE for organizing this. I think it makes us feel better to be in this community of strong democracy supporters. I've had the great privilege for decades of working to promote accountable governance at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level. And one thing I was particularly proud to be part of was the development and launch of the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation. And that's relevant for our discussion today because the way it works, the MCC, is it invites governments of countries that data show to be relatively well and democratically governed in terms of investing in their people, supporting human rights and democratic freedoms, economic freedoms, fighting corruption. They invite them to participate in a program where they can get very large development grants. And so what it does is it measures your performance on democracy, it rewards it, it incentivizes it, and it gives a lot of credit publicly to those that are doing a good job. And I raise that because I think a lot of us here are very alarmed at the backsliding on democratic practices, the quality of democratic systems. And I think a lot of us have a pretty good sense of what those should be like and what they look like. But we don't always know how we can make them live again and how to revitalize popular support for them. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. So first, evidence is very clear. Democratic systems, strong ones, deliver better results for their people in terms of growth, in terms of social indicators, and in terms of peace and stability. But what we're seeing is a decline in the number and quality of democracies. And we've all heard about how little trust there is these days by citizens in their institutions and in their governments. They're at a historic low. But here's the thing. When elected governments and officials cannot or will not deliver for their people in terms of their well-being, their security, their productivity, that opens the door to what we're seeing today, which is this aggressive political winner-take-all behavior. The things are very connected. The weaker our democracies are, the more opportunity there is for the manipulation and misinformation of the public. And we know that most people, or many people in the world today, do not feel that their governments are delivering for them. And they're rightfully frustrated. And they see their governments failing to address really big challenges, such as the pandemic, climate change, corruption, misinformation, and division. So when a flawed democracy fails to meet its citizens' needs, people rightfully become frustrated, and then they're very easily manipulated into directing their anger at all sorts of others. And they often pledge loyalty to those they are told will protect and reward them. So average citizens are being turned into political shock troops to secure someone else's unchecked power and wealth. This makes flawed democracies even weaker. Today, anti-democratic forces are unleashing this hostility towards election management bodies, especially if those EMBs try to be unbiased and professional. Just last week, I spoke with New Mexico's Secretary of State. She described to me the constant barrage of hostility, mistrust, and misguided complaints that she and other election officials are experiencing. And we all know of cases where political parties are actively undermining and disparaging EMBs to their voters. So the truth is, Strong democratic EMBs can fail where parties are bad, and parties that respect democracy can easily fail where EMBs are weak or undemocratic. Here's the thing. In resilient democratic systems, strong institutions are mutually reinforcing. In flawed democratic systems, institutional weakness is contagious. So political parties and democracy supporters must remind and demonstrate to voters that well-functioning democracies with free and fair elections deliver better results. People need to feel invested in democracy because it serves them. We also need to make the very powerful case to voters that everyone's rights and economic opportunities are at risk in undemocratic regimes, even those that come to power through elections. Lashing out and discriminating against others and trashing democratic principles to deliver unchecked power to a small group is not a winning strategy for ordinary citizens anywhere. In other words, autocracy and populism are not winning strategies even for the citizens that support them. The most important thing is this: we must now define and be positioned together to measure progress on electoral democracy, democratic political parties, and unbiased, effective EMBs. If you can't measure it, you can't fix it, you can't improve it, and you can't hold anyone accountable for the performance of these institutions and our democracies. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are many indicators of good governance: the MCC's country scorecards, the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, Freedom House's Freedom Index, the EIU's Democracy Index, so many. But they generally measure very general levels of democracy in any given society. They're great. No one source or indicator is perfect, but together they do tell us a lot about democratic governance conditions and trends. But we also need to better educate ourselves and others on the analysis and recommendations by democracy organizations on EMBs and political parties. We need to be able to advocate for credible indicators, measurable indicators, and progress assessments on these bodies. The UNDP published a massive handbook on EMBs 20 years ago, and we know a lot more now. The Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, one of your partners today, they organize dialogues on codes of conduct and best practices and how EMBs can be strengthened. The ACE Electoral Knowledge Network offers insights and expertise and codes of conduct on EMBs and parties. For example, in 2021, the Netherlands became the first country to adopt and implement a voluntary code of conduct for non-misleading political advertising. Imagine that. We need to assess and learn from those results. There's much we can build on, and we can examine how new technology can help us assess and measure the strength and quality of our democratic institutions. We know a lot about how EMBs and political parties can contribute. But what we need to do now is use indicators, develop and use them together, of whether EMBs and political parties are incorporating best practices, operating democratically, are adequately resourced and legally acknowledged and protected. It does us no good if there's a law in the books and it's not enforced and nobody cares. If we measure the quality and strength of political parties and EMBs, we can improve them, and we can hold officials accountable for their performance. These indicators don't have to be perfect. They just have to be useful and credible, and we can make them better over time. As I learned at the MCC, the very act of measuring, reporting, and rewarding good performance often makes governments want to do better. People aren't angels. Officials are not angels. They will do what advantages them. So we really need to work together to support politically and materially, based on measurable indicators of performance and progress, political parties and EMBs. If we do that, they can help us rebuild voters' trust in elections and in democracy itself. Another thing we can do, all of us, is urge financial institutions, donors, and development organizations to support and politically and financially those governments and political institutions which meet or credibly commit to meet agreed criteria and indicators, granular ones, for well-functioning EMBs and parties, and then recognize them publicly for doing so. I include in that even things like credit ratings and ESG assessments. We need to be granular on these things. Finally, we have to make sure that the performance of a country's systems and political bodies, including parties and EMBs, are reported honestly. Citizens need to have access to information about the quality of their democratic institutions. I know that political leaders sometimes see international focus on the quality of their institutions as unwelcome interference. But let's be honest, democratic governance is a global public good, and we need to treat it that way. We must assess and build the capacity and will of EMPs and voters to ensure legitimate elections. I agree with those who are calling for a multi-stakeholder global democracy alliance to carry these efforts forward. People who live in undemocratic, repressive regimes cannot drive change alone. And often, as Mr. Romero said, international crime syndicates are involved in those problems. And that makes it impossible for people in a given country to address these issues all by themselves. They need international support. The international community needs to organize around a shared vision and a plan of action, which includes incentives, rewards, and measurement. We got to reverse this global deficit in democracy. There are solutions. Progress is possible if we cooperate and commit to measure results on democracy's promise and its potential, including by the use of new technology. I thank you for that, and I look forward to working with you all.
Muchas gracias, doctora Pence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pence. Now, Dr. Monica Pachon, you have 7 minutes. And if you're so kind as to talk just for time that's given to us. I would like to know if you can hear me well. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Martin, for this great presentation, and my peers from the panel, Salvador Romero and Pence and the INE, for inviting me to this great summit to participate in this topic. I would like to talk about my perspective as an academician, and I would like to use words from Mr. Michael Fendo when he says we need to talk about democracy. That's a work in progress. It's a work in progress democracy. So when we can work with this definition and understand that citizens from all countries in Latin America and around the world have more information, it doesn't mean that they have more knowledge or better informed. And we need to rethink about formulas and within them, the political parties. In the world, we can see how intermediaries are being eliminated. Citizens feel they do not need political parties anymore, and politicians have been able to see how its absence has a great advantage. I come from Colombia, independent world, let's say, part of the world, and we have 2 electoral systems. One where executive elections, we only get independent groups participation, the collegiate ones through electoral mechanics, parties that are coalitions. And politics is more of individuals and less institutionalized. So it's important to understand that that individualization leads us to fragmentation in regard to political issues because we have more individuals than EMBs, let's say, and that will favor radicalization and lack of experience in politics. In Latin America, we've been able to see how candidates that go to a second turn and they are radical and being questioned. They question the status quo, and elections do not solve problems by having given elections. The one that wins, wins, takes all. That logic, what we're going to have at the end is a world where elections are not something that will act to calm us down. That system is going to decrease the fire, but we're adding more fire to a situation that's already under fire and institutions are under attack. Another phenomena, how we communicate and inform ourselves, media and communication means in this debate is decreased because the media as citizens and politicians have incentives and they play to lead to this radicalization. Ernesto Calvo, a really interesting research he did from Maryland University, how the media reputation limits those means that are going to promote fake news, but we have many digital means that live from fake news. So our citizens receive fake news and they can communicate directly with leaders, and that's how they create this radicalization and they can commit many mistakes. And we do not have political sophistication in regard to information, neither enough radicalization. So citizens, when they get fake news, they have a world where basically they can easily be manipulated. And the electoral institutions, CMBs, in regard to elections, play a fundamental role in this game. And I have to say that institutions have helped us fundamental to maintain democracy. They have done it for years. So political parties, they become serious organizations and entities, but they have made committed mistakes too. And sometimes suddenly they try to regulate things, and because that's our nature, right, to regulate and regulate issues and not to have the capacity, skills to have a good control of them. As I could say, equivalent to all organizations, and that could be read as an arbitrary exercise. So my advice within this context, I have to say EMPs must abide the law and be minimalistic. By that, I mean go back to the core, as Salvador mentioned. The EMPs, what's their role? And elections, what's its fundament, its basis, and try to protect that above all things. And to go into new functions could lead us as reading the MBs as being arbitrary bodies. We have to be careful with that level of specificity. In our regulations in Colombia, they have suspended mayors in the middle of an electoral process. That's awful because they destroy the whole system. And it's important to know that we are judged. We cannot be a part of it too. So we need to have clear concepts about it. Why? Because to be activists is incompatible in regard to political discussions to be trusted as an EMB. And we give reasons to anti-democratic groups to take our reputation out from us. We need to have transparency over all things in our electoral processes so we can find that objectiveness above all things. So the organization be not so attacked. And to conclude, I have to say that we citizens do not have all the information and we don't want to be well informed. We're not interested on that. So we need to practice the exercise that all people are practicing. Communication is a fundamental issue. To simplify is better than complicated things because that doesn't help democracy at all and will put fire under more fire, and that's a huge mistake because we fall on given temptation. We need to avoid given protagonism on EMBs because this will create a higher danger. Could be a unilateral, subjective, not serious participation, and at the end can harm the whole democratic process. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Chacon. A pleasure, she said. Pachon is here, last name. And perspective conveyed in this panel through Dr. Romero. I don't want to change their last name. In regard to all these different perspectives, what can we expect? And they talk about 7 specific scenarios in regard to what we could face as democracies in our electoral processes. Some of these elements are good, others are risky or could present a danger. And I have to say, as Dr. Pence concluded, that we shouldn't take for granted the democratic attributes when we center ourselves just on the technical part that's already consolidated, that will progress towards new technological perspectives. But to take for granted, let's say, the social value of democracy, we shouldn't do so. We need to insist that over and over again. And as Dr. Pence mentioned, the great importance of having indicators, key indicators, that we have a series of them that will allow us to measure efficacy and the social value of elections and the democratic system, even with this perspective that they both mentioned, that people do not perceive that there's a huge change in their lives, that democratic life is changing, and it's changing their life too. One of the biggest risks we've been facing, and they have been mentioned at this summit, but also as we get useful indicators and principles, the way democracy enhances people's life, and the importance of maintaining these democratic values for all of us under these contexts that are so adverse, and they're more adverse as time goes by. And Dr. Pachon also talked about the great importance of the role of the MB's role that's so important, their role. And as she mentioned specifically, how the CMBs must be centralized on transparency, objectivity of their processes, not to be the judge of it and be part of it, and to avoid protagonism that at a given moment could be not so useful and not to help us within this context. And the doctor talked about the importance of going towards a minimalism, of not having more attributes to our EMBs, but they could only be centralized on fundamental topics. Well, this panel has presented these great perspectives. We have questions that I would like to convey them, general questions. Do you think that if governments implement a democracy on middle school, we could have a better education, a better world? Another one specifically for Dr. Romero, if you can describe us more about electoral deterioration signals. Another question rapidly for Dr. Pence, and Pence, that says, inefficient policies, and he switched baja la participación en las elecciones. Existe
can do to improve political inefficacy. Espero haber sido. Bien, pues entonces tendrían hasta.
So you have 3 minutes, please. Each one of our speakers, same order as you presented your talk, please, Dr. Romero.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. I would like to highlight 2 important elements regarding these warning signs. First, relates to the rule of presidential re-elections without mandate limits, which is clearly associated with the biggest backslides in the region. That is when presidents are allowed to re-elect themselves over and over with no limit in the number of mandates, and that is clearly one of the most worrisome signs associated with democratic deterioration in Latin America. Number 2, and something that requires attention, is when MBEs are accosted by the government or are co-opted by the government. An MBE manipulated, controlled by the government will probably or will likely decrease the elements of competitiveness in the political system and restricting the possibility to have legitimate opposition candidates. And that is another one of the most important indicators we see in the region that are signs of democratic deterioration. Undoubtedly, these elements are not specifically related with technical elements, but the main essential democratic characteristics of elections, and we should bring our attention back to these democratic elements. We should not just look at the technical quality of the processes, which is important, but it is necessary to bring back a more political and democratic view, focusing on the development of the elections, which means that you have to be focusing on the whole election cycle, not just the elections themselves, to look at all the different elements. And that will help us determine whether those elements before the elections were democratic or not, to see whether all actors in the political scenario were able to compete freely, fairly in the election. Thank you very much, Dr. Romero. And Pence,
I'm very sorry to say I didn't hear my question because my interpretation broke up in English just as the question was being read. So if you could quickly repeat it, I'd be very grateful.
Okay. Political inefficacy is the fundamental reason behind low popular participation in elections. Is there anything AMRS
can do to improve political inefficacy?
If I understand the question properly, you're asking if we can improve people's sense that they have a stake in voting because they need to understand that they win when their systems are representative, honest, and accountable. And I guess I would sidebar to say that with 70% of the world's population living in autocracies, we can't fool ourselves. We are facing a very uphill battle on this. Autocracies don't feel like they have to deliver for their people, and they don't. That's a fact. That's why I said we need a global democracy alliance. I also said nobody wants a bad report card on their democracy. So it's incumbent upon the rest of us, those who live in functioning democracies, those who aspire to functioning democracy, and those who want to see people's lives made better under functional democratic systems, to put together those indicators and deliver those report cards, even when the message isn't well received. We also have to put our money and our political power where our mouths are. We have to encourage big financial institutions, governments, multilateral institutions to reward those that are doing a good job. It's much easier to do that than to punish those that are not doing a good job because we have limited means to do so. We also have to invest in the good news stories, even in weak democracies. We forget sometimes, because it's hard work, to invest in democracy organizations, as people have said here, in training and education of the voters, of young people, and of finding ways to include them. I'm on the advisory board of a human rights organization that's all youth oriented. I'm far the oldest person involved. And what they do is they reach out across borders throughout the world. They've developed an online network and online events and online fora for democracy activists around the world. We have to do a lot more than that. This is just one little NGO. If we all want to live in a democratic world where we solve big problems like pandemics and climate change, which is an existential threat, we're not going to be able to do that if we don't have democratic institutions that function. As I said, democracy is a global public good. So I feel very badly for those people who don't feel as if their vote counts, because oftentimes they're absolutely right. And what we have to do is call that out more forcefully, not be afraid to embarrass officials who are doing bad jobs, and stick together and use all the leverage that we can possibly muster, especially to reward good performance, to make progress happen. We have to measure it. As I said, we have to measure it, we have to show it based on indicators, and we must do so as an international democracy community.
Gracias.
Thank you. Dr. Monica Pachon, you have up to 3 minutes for your answer. I'll go to the question of whether it's a good idea to teach democracy. And let me tell you this. I am a teacher in a design department. I want to tell you this because I believe that it is important to understand that right now information makes no difference. How do you raise as citizens? Well, you start by raising interest in them. And there's a lot of interest. Political participation has increased. What has not increased is knowledge about the state or how public issues are solved. For example, in design classes, we work in solving public issues with institutions. So students think about the problem of, for example, trash or garbage, or those who work in the informal market when they sell in the streets, occupying public space without harming others, or urban mobility issues, long distances some people have to travel, and how to solve the problem starting from territorial order, and how people who are participating in elections know something about those candidates they are voting for. So you have to start by creating an interest in the students. So how can we help people get better knowledge of democracy? Well, the formula is not bringing students to sit down and hear about democratic processes. We better make them interested in public issues, and these issues have different complexities that are wonderful, and different levels of to be resolved. And the more people we have wanting to work on those issues, the better we'll be, because getting information, being informed, comes as a consequence of being interested in getting the information and not a reason that is an obligation for me to sit down and listen to a class. So we are facing great opportunities. Technology is offering a great chance for citizenship, but I don't think that you have to force anyone to sit down and listen about democratic processes. And the question is, why do we need a democratic process? We need it to solve issues of citizens that citizens face in their everyday life. Thank you very much. So now I should just want to thank every person participating in the panel. Dr. Salvador Romero, thank you very much for your participation. Dr. Ann Pence, thank you very much. And Dr. Monica Pachon. The elements that were brought to the table are very important elements, and we have to think about them during this summit. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to thank our moderator and panel members. We'll have a brief break, 3 minutes. The next panel members are ready. They will be talking about the main findings of the America Regional Forum. Thank you very much.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
Porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia. Pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos,
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches en otras partes del mundo.
Good morning, good evening, good night. The next panel that we're gonna have is to present the main findings from a regional fora from the Americas. And we have as a moderator, Laura Poyet, as Regional Undersecretariat from the International Republican Institute for Latin America and the Caribbean. I give the floor to her. Thank you very much, Manuel. Morning, a pleasure to share this event with you and to have colleagues with IPES, with the ones we have the objective of strengthening democracy around the world. On behalf of IRI, I would like to thank INE for the leadership in organizing this important event. At present, Latin American region is living a more complicated moment in regard to democracy. We've been witness of this weakening of our democracies, and they have various countries in the region have suffered. And also we have seen conjunctural changes that have been procreated. As mentioned before, there's a crisis in regard to basic agreements and lack of international systems to have good governance. We observe reappearance of wars and effects on societies, as well as a weak regional integration. In this regard, I would like to emphasize three fundamental pillars for the correct functioning of democracy in the region. First, we need a strong institutions, independent ones that can respond to needs of the citizens and that can act as a check and balance of a possible imbalance of institutions. Better informed citizens, they need to understand what are their rights and duties as citizens from the Republic, and so they get involved too on these public events. Aligned with the strengthening of our institutions, we need to guarantee electoral processes that are legitimate, clean, and reliable. And role played by EMBs, it's of huge importance. And many countries within the region, we can see a growing political lack of trust because of lack of representation, and also lack of trust between representatives and those that are being represented because of cases of corruption, impunity, uncomplied campaign promises. And this is what led us to the surgence of populist and authoritarian leaders. Also, we know that populist leaders use democratic processes to have access to power. Once they're in power, they dismantle their checks and balances, alarming so many attacks being faced by some electoral authorities around the world, and specifically in our continent. In some cases, through budgetary cuts, in others, by trying to control the MBs. In other cases, like Nicaragua and Venezuela, we've been witnesses of how they have damaged democracy through establishing sanctions to MBs and electoral processes. That is why today more than ever, we must be sure that they feel ungiven intentions and to recover our democracy before an electoral group that's more demanding, by protecting the integrity of the electoral authorities that are the foundation of our democracies, and to be able to foster the participation of citizens on electoral processes rapidly and more inclusive democracy. Without taking more time, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Saldivar that will talk about the main findings and conclusions of the regional fora. He is the regional director for the American and the Caribbean region of the IRI and IPES. Thank you, Laura. Good morning. Greetings to councilors of INE and also President Lorenzo Cordova for inviting us, and the different EMBs that are participating in this important summit. And greetings to my friend of steps that talked before. And today, a pleasure to present a summary of main conclusions that were reached on July 28 during the regional fora in the Americas in regard to this summit, where we had participation of academicians, independent experts, electoral authorities, members of the civil society, and representatives of many specialized organizations that are part of this summit that will conclude today in Mexico City. And the fora began with the former President Luis Guillermo Solis from Costa Rica during keynote convey a message that helped us to have faith and have reflection and discussion that we are looking for. He mentioned that democracy is not forever and we can see it and we're paying for not taking care of it. And we cannot take it for granted because we're having backsliding. And he emphasized attacks being suffered by democracies come from many sides, and to defend it must be collective. And finally, former President Solis mentioned that there's a norm in Latin America that allows it to happen, and we need to support it, and we need to make democracy be there and to use it again. And the fora was made up of 6 main pillars. It's the floating line of representative democracies, the role of EMBs to maintain democratic order and menaces to its independency, democracy, digital platforms, freedom of expression, risks and dilemmas of the EMBs in the region, and political violence, and new issues about electoral fraud and integrity of our elections. In regard to the first idea, this flotation line talks about the minimum levels so democracy works fully, and the autocrats start to attack our secondary rights, an element to weaken our democracy, given leaders that accuse real democracies. As mentioned by Laura rapidly during his presentation, autocratic leaders, little by little, are ending with our democratic values, see the global climate to impose their ideas that seem to be democratic policies and exploit what seem to be real values to legitimate themselves. Another conclusion we reached. At present, the region is living a remilitarization of the elites and alliances between stakeholders in an illicit manner. Seems like we are having this backsliding. And they concluded as a huge concern globally, we're going back to 1989 norms in regard to democracy. More than 30 years we have had progress, but we're losing too. To guarantee free and competitive elections, fair ones, is not enough in our region. And this was considered as a huge mistake to believe that it was enough to guarantee it. And that is why many of them now are eroding our democracy. And going back to the second pillar, a really important one in this summit, role of the EMBs to maintain democratic order and menaces against its independence. And also, Mr. Lorenzo Cordoba has told us about it. It's necessary for EMBs to have independence and autonomy to guarantee their political rights and to be a mechanism of control to go against corruption. Also mentioned that there are 3 main points that can be carried out to defend our EMBs adequately. And the first one, the need to reinvent our communication skills from our EMBs. Ecosystem has changed. And today the EMBs do not only have to carry out elections with high technical standards, must be capable of deploying strategies of communication that are assertive and be carried out on a timely manner. Second, to go beyond the direct democratic principles and to conclude rapidly to promote a digital citizenship, considering the relevance and impact that social media has on us. And they concluded that electoral EMBs must have a great communication strategy. As mentioned before, a well-organized election process will give good results, but if it's badly communicated, it's a bad management because the EMBs, they produce trust. And if citizens do not understand what happened, or even worse, they think that the result was a fraud, it's not good to organize an election and do a good counting of votes. And now, rapidly talking about the democracy, digital platforms, freedom of expression, they concluded even though social networks mean to democratize power, also have lower freedom of expression has led us to situations like fake news. Freedom of expression is not absolute. We need to understand that to recognize that there's some attitudes that are illegal, that lose that appreciation in our world. There's a trend that shows a high popularity, and most people are part of that digitalization of communication, and they present a huge opportunities to express ourselves. It means problems too, at least in regard to limits between freedom of expression and the right to disseminate private information. And this is really important that democratic institutions are not, they cannot go against fake news under same conditions due to two main reasons. First, those that misinform us do not use legal data, and the institutional communication needs to respect legality. And those that create these fake news can communicate them using all the different possibilities they have available, while institutions have an ethic responsibility based just on bureaucratic answers, even though they do not create or generate higher interest. And by progressing to the fourth axis, risks and dilemma of the political electoral agenda in the region, they recognize that there's a crisis in regard to lack of trust. A really interesting survey includes just Central America. Results in Guatemala, just 17% are trust the EMB, 12% in Honduras, 26% in El Salvador, 44% in Costa Rica, 38% in Panama. And before this situation, we need to act on well-being of people. So democracies be strong, not only by strengthening political parties and EMBs. By this, I mean the way to strengthen democracy is by armoring its institutions and having debates about the well-being of citizens and its link to democracy. And they also said that if elections allow us to solve problems in a peaceful manner, that powerful idea is what today is not so clear anymore. And we can see it visibly being eroded. They also mention political parties have this idea that they're not anymore representing interest of the population, so we need to reflect about it. And they concluded that Latin America, we have institutions in most of our strong consolidated countries where we have technical capacities, but the democracy is not accompanied with efforts in strengthening of our democracies. By this, I mean that we do not have a correlationship in regard to democratic dilemma to reduce poverty and inequality, exclusion, and strengthening of democracy in our countries. And the sixth axis in regard to political violence and violence, gender violence, EMBs must have measures to maintain the trend of having parity participation. And in case of the political parties, it's necessary to have norm strategies internally that will allow us to guarantee the substantial task under electoral processes. And rapidly, I have to say they talk about rules must allow us to be sure that women have parity participation, and half of the candidacies must be Effectively, women must be elected, not just to be at the end of the lists. And I recognize the importance that the EMBs have in regard to work they have to implement, because precisely they need good EMBs with all the capacities to have all the necessary activity to supervise what political parties do by analyzing if they comply with measures that have been implemented by obliging them to comply with rules and gender quotas. And this accompanied with a promotion with these topics, because we need from activists and stakeholders that lead us to have this gender parity. In regard to the last axis, the sixth one in the Americas Regional Fora, in regard to electoral frauds and implication for the integrity of elections, they mentioned that what discussed on social networks and frauds in our countries are stronger, and they have inserted in public conversation. In Latin America, we've been able to observe how they tend to accuse the electoral authorities of fraud, and there's mistrust on them, on EMBs, even though they have had good electoral processes. Not necessarily it has been translated or having better democracy and trust on EMBs that are attacked through different front lines. At present, we need to take into account capacity of some political groups that make viral fake news that affect electoral democracies. Concluded, it's evident their campaigns against EMBs, and they have carried out a serious and impartial job. They have carried out clean elections. Today, clean elections could be attacked as fraudulent elections. And, these campaigns against us start at an early stage, not just near the electoral process, including core elements, either because they unqualify the electoral body or because they attack its processes. Example, the electoral roll, the electronic ballot box, voting from abroad, etc. So this diversity of processes has been attacked, and they are still being attacked in countries in Latin America that at present are still under an electoral process that will conclude by the end of the year. And they make the citizens trust us, and social networks that play a good role, and they do not have technical experience in electoral processes. So they keep alive accusations against us. They make them viral through social networks that filtrate themselves rapidly to show accusation against actors is false. We need a rapid response and technical response that's not easy for the MBs. And I would like to conclude by saying, after this rapid summary, and I would like to have all this information in detail in regard to the regional fora, INE has available this final report. And if you have questions, please do not hesitate. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. I would like to talk a little bit about the system or where EMBs should work during the regional forum. As you mentioned, there were several lines of debate between political parties and civil organizations and their role in the electoral environment. Could you share with us a little bit of this? Have you seen examples in the region or other parts of the world where EMB and civil society and political parties work well together to foster trust in electoral results? Thank you, Laura. And yes, it is a challenge, definitely. In the last 2 years, even during the pandemic, we've seen many EMBs under attack, starting with the host country, Mexico, where significant attacks have been undertaken against electoral authorities. We're seeing it in Peru before the regional elections on October the 2nd, and Brazil, we have noticed as well. It is a trend in Latin America that is becoming stronger, and I agree with you. Sometimes you have to go beyond, they go beyond public attacks by cutting budgets and not considering when important electoral decisions are made regarding electoral reforms. So that is a trend, but we also see some hope because I believe citizens recognize the importance of having an arbitration and how to preserve the integrity of electoral processes. There are countries where we have seen an improvement where there were issues, but then things moved forward in a better way. But I agree with you. It requires joint efforts, not just of the EMB, but all democratic entities in society. Thank you, Max. Another question. You talked about the findings and social media and the digital information space. Could we talk a little bit about lessons learned regarding always had a tool at their disposal? It may seem simple, but it is important. We were mentioning budget cuts, and because some areas need to be uh, prioritized, and civic education. Civic education is important. It is a tool. It is available for EMBs, but it is necessary to go back to that tool and reinvest in it and use it. Because civic information can counteract disinformation in the electoral context. One last question regarding organized crime. Do you think that this is a general issue with presence in electoral processes? As a Central American citizen, yes, it is sad, but in Central America, we are seeing these organizations trying to get territory. They want influence to control the territory so they can continue with their illicit activities, and therefore they have influence in electoral processes. This is mostly local, where it's easier for them to influence under threat or by using money or by attacks. But we see that their ambitions go beyond the territory control. They try to influence the legislative process in some countries, and they try to influence other areas of the country. But it is a trend that we can see in Latin America. As an expert said in the forum, we are looking at these different actors that include organized crime. Thank you very much for this analysis and your words. We want to congratulate once again INE, the president, councilors, and their resilient technical team. 32 local councils and all the district councils, which are one of the most respected electoral EMBs in the world. This summit is a sign of the willingness to adapt to the new times, recognizing they need to be at the leading edge, and we must all go along with them in their struggle to overcome obstacles in their way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura Bellot Alvarez and Max Saldivar, for your contribution. Thank you very much for your participation during the ending panels of the summit. We will take a short break, and we will go to final comments and closing. Thank you very much.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
Porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia. Pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos, logramos que todas las voces cuenten. Unidas y unidos vivimos en una democracia sin muros que nos dividan. Unidas
Luchamos por nuestros derechos.
y unidos hemos conseguido tener elecciones libres y auténticas. Por eso inspiramos al mundo para proteger la democracia, los derechos y nuestras libertades, porque ese es el camino de la paz. México es sede de la Cumbre Global de la Democracia Electoral, porque en el mundo y en México, nuestro INE nos une.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good night in the other regions of the world where you're following this last day of our Global Summit for Democracy. In this last session, the final considerations and closing ceremony, we have the General Secretariat, Mr. Kevin Casas, from the Secretary General from IDEA, Michael Frendo, Vice Chairman of the Venice Commission, and Dr. Lorenzo Cordova. Thank you very much, Manuel. And thank you very much for giving us this great opportunity. I would like to thank the National Electoral Institute of Mexico and all the MBs who have called us to carry out this electoral summit. And we are really proud of being part of this great effort that has been astonishing, because I have to say has had a global dimension. So I would like to congratulate first President and Board of the Member, Dr. Lorenzo Cordova from the INE, and also all of you who have participated through so many years by projecting the Mexican electoral process along the world. So I would like to congratulate you, and we're really happy of being part of this important effort. The Global Summit for Electoral Democracy has been crucial for electoral processes at our level, and we are full of risks for our electoral activities. First of all, we can see, and we've been able to see lately, a deliberate effort on behalf of authoritarian political movements to change the trust on our elections. And that has happened in different manners. In some cases, by means of attacks, political attacks, deliberated political attacks against EMBs, like the INE of Mexico and in Brazil too, where, as we've been able to know, they've been trying to go against this. And what we know about is that the authoritarian projects always attack the control exerting those that want to have power. They attack free media and trusted elections, because free elections is the most important control to go against power. And I was just thinking about the minimalistic definition presented by politologist from the USA's Adam Shaborsky that said, a democracy, it's a system where the political party in power doesn't want to accept free electoral results. And this is true in Latin America, because the presence of this risk is true in Latin America, and mainly of great concern, because progress in regard to electoral processes and progress in this great effort to construct real electoral processes that can be trusted on is the most important part of this democratic construction in Latin America in the last 40 years. We have failed in other areas in regard to democratic construction, but the electoral processes in the region, we have advanced a lot. We need to protect it. And it means that we need to have we need to protect the autonomy of the EMBs in our region. Now then, same as I mentioned before, we're living risks and also opportunities to for EMBs because of what we've been able to see along the pandemic situation. The electoral component of democracy is exceptionally resilient. During all this process, all this time, the last 2 years and a half, we've been able to see innovations by means of the use of digital technologies. And when the pandemic began, all of us, we had a huge concern that there was going to be a huge dislocation of our electoral schedules around the world. And we had it at the beginning of the pandemic situation. And then we saw an extraordinary process of learning process from the electoral processes and other actors, other stakeholders. A learning process to celebrate elections that we could trust on, robust elections under really difficult situations created by the pandemic situation. So the electoral component of our democracies have been able to show that are more robust than what we thought at the beginning of the pandemic situation. These are critical moments for our elections, but also of great productivity, because it calls us all to strengthen credibility on EMBs. And we need to go on forward by having positive innovation to make easier to be able for all of us to vote. And I was thinking about alternative mechanisms to exert voting. And it's a moment that calls us all to go through innovation, to have more open processes, open electoral processes, to be more transparent, counting of votes, to be more efficient, with our mechanisms for dispute resolution during electoral processes. To progress in this agenda, all of you can count with IDEA International, with our efforts to can maintain lessons learned from electoral processes around the world, to disseminate them, and to have concrete joint efforts to keep on supporting EMBs. That's our mission, and we're not going to abandon it, because success of given mission, success from our efforts to have better electoral processes in new epochs, depends on our democratic constructions. And I have to say that without free, periodical, legitimate, and trustworthy elections, there's no democracy. That's clear. But also, we're fortunate because we're living historical times. As Carlos said, to repeat what's obvious is what sensible people do. So, without free, periodical, legitimate elections, there's no democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin Casa, Secretary General, for your words and for your encouragement to continue with democratic work. We give the floor to Dr. Lorenzo Cordova, President of Mexico's National Electoral Institute. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of those here today in Mexico City. Good afternoon, those who are joining virtually from other parts of the world. It is a privilege to share this final panel with my very much admired friend, Dr. Kevin Casas. And it is an honor to be here with all the different representatives from organizations that made this joint effort possible. In May this year, a wide alliance of electoral authorities, including the National Electoral Institute of Mexico and other international and regional organizations and public centers for reflection, called to start thinking together openly and publicly on the current state of democracy, elections, and electoral integrity in every region of the world. Forums were celebrated in Africa, America, Asia, Europe, and the Arab region around June of this year. And the reflections emphasized the need to understand the dimension and the scope of the very important challenges faced by democracies throughout the world, and the urgency to defend independency and autonomy of electoral bodies, a key element of citizen trust in the authorities and in elections as well. Elections that, as Kevin said, and I will complement by quoting Mr. Ortega and Gasset, elections had that small technical detail on which the whole democratic apparatus depends. A wide diversity of visions, experiences, and recommendations were exchanged in the 5 regional forums, and the main conclusions were presented during this World Summit of Electoral Democracy that ends today. This is the end of a process of reflection and analysis to start with new roads, to start with a new agenda of collaboration and collective action for the defense of democracy and free, fair elections throughout the planet. Many different topics were presented and discussed in the last months and in these last few days, but among those we can identify the following. Some of the questionings made to democracy, given to its difficulty to give response to large structural issues in our times, suffered by societies. Voices in regional forums and in the Global Summit agree that such issues can only be solved following democratic institutionality and according to the rules of the democratic game itself. That is, within the institutional itself, within the democratic array that we have. Number 2, persistence and increase of structural problems in our time, including inequality, poverty, violence, corruption, and many times insecurity. And none of them it can be attributed to electoral democracy, have not only led to losing trust in key democratic institutions, but have become culture medium for political leaderships that strongly show authoritative trends. And the trend towards a concentration of power, the capture or colonization of autonomous institutions to ensure balances and checks in our constitutional democracies, towards a reduction of civic spaces favorable for informed public debate, towards the harassment of freedom of speech and the exercise of critical and free journalism are present to a greater or lesser extent in many representative democracies around the world, with a dangerous trend towards an increase. And there is also consensus regarding the need of facing these issues collectively and coordinatedly by bringing together efforts of as many institutions, organizations, and sectors that agree with democratic values. Fifth, from every region and from different contexts, it has been emphasized that impartiality and independence of electoral bodies are fundamental elements in order to preserve and strengthen the democratic order. This independence is important for the full exercise of political rights and integrity of elections. Six, due to the strategic importance of wielding power in democratic, there's a lot of examples of attempts to vulnerate the integrity of EMBs. Therefore, voices in regional forums and this global summit agree that it is urgent to build alliances to defend and to stop the deterioration of electoral integrity, harassment to authorities in charge of elections, and using polarization as a political strategy. Seven, there's wide consensus regarding how critical it is for democratic health to strongly foster education for democracy initiatives, free, fair, transparent elections, supported by plural deliberation processes, tolerant to legitimate differences in societies, demand citizen practices every day that will lead an extended civic culture. For that reason, it is essential to educate for democracy inside and outside schools, acknowledging differences in different contexts and using technologies and the most innovative methods that can be used in order to foster assimilation and everyday practice of the values supporting democratic life in every part of society's life, not just in the political plane. Another point of agreement is that in the last months and during the summit, efforts to attain effective gender equality in participation and political representation and to prevent, combat, and eradicate gender political violence have been expressed. At the same time, a call has been made to continue fostering a change towards this direction. And with full reason, it's been insisted that EMBs and international organizations must continue enlarging and facilitating channels for political participation, opening it to groups traditionally excluded, not just women, but youth, indigenous populations, migrants, and people with diverse sexualities, among others. It is important to remember that this is a sign of values and principles in a democracy. Almost unanimously, voices in the forums and the summit say that fake news and misinformation have caused huge disruption in democratic and electoral environments. Disinformation is a symptom of a wider process of citizen mistrust. Its effects have really run over and are leading to intolerance, which makes the action of EMBs even more complex. Therefore, it is important to adopt different strategies, ideally preventative, not punitive, with a co-responsibility of every single stakeholder to ensure freedom of speech and at the same time to eliminate incentives to polarizing and hate speech. As I said, the Global Summit puts an end to the first part of a process that is just beginning. Today, we are taking the first steps of a new global agenda for the defense and promotion of electoral democracy throughout the world. This is about building cooperation mechanisms that are more effective and timely than those we have been able to create so far, to create spaces for dialogue and exchanging experiences, including these forums, including this summit, but maybe this could be done more frequently. And it is worth to propose the members of the 17 organizations of this partnership that made this global summit possible, and of which INE is proudly a member of, to get together, ideally next year, to look at the balance of the issues and alternatives and solutions we have identified. And en route to a second summit, we should collaborate to open national, regional, and continental spaces for reflection, to bring in more voices, to bring new perspectives, to enrich our diagnosis, but also to discuss possible solutions and contribute to increase our alliance and partnerships for democracy. Bringing this alliance in the next months is a task for each one of us. INE, who is in charge of watching the rights, and we are committed to defend civic culture and electoral democracy in Mexico and the world, will contribute. Thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation for your participation in the forums and the summit. Your voices resonate with clarity, resonate with strength, and our collective voice for democracy, for free and fair elections is just the first step towards joint actions that will be fostered everywhere in this planet. Thank you very much, and have a good, those of us who travel, have a good trip back home. Thank you to those of you in Mexico and those of you who are joining us remotely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lorenzo Cordova, and thank you, IDE International Secretary General. Hopefully, we will meet again next year, and we will continue working. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
Porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia. Pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos, logramos que todas las voces cuenten. Unidas y unidos vivimos en una democracia sin muros que nos dividan. Unidas.
Luchamos por nuestros derechos.
Y unidos hemos conseguido tener elecciones libres y auténticas. Por eso inspiramos al mundo para proteger la democracia, los derechos y nuestras libertades, porque ese es el camino de la paz. México es sede de la Cumbre Global de la Democracia Electoral, porque en el mundo y en México, nuestro INE nos une.